Shalom and welcome to another Chamor podcast from Bay Abedan, teaching Noahide Judaism for Messianic Hebrews. Proto-Socialism for Edom is a Messianic Hebrew channel where Messianic Hebrews are kind of Noahide and does not include the idea of Messianic Jews. Messianic Jews are one of our targets that we hope to recruit, ask them to give up their way of identifying themselves as Messianic Jews and say, look, you've got to come over to this side of the fence because you're on the dark side if you're a Messianic Jew. You've got to be a Messianic Hebrew where there is no Jew and there is no Gentile. They're all together in the abedan and following the laws of the ger, the laws of the ger toshav. You have to uphold your Hebrew brother as a toshav if they are fallen on hard times. And sin is also a hard time that many people fall upon, and Jews can fall upon too. And when that happens, they are invited to become toshavim, not to carry on calling themselves Jews, regardless, and to pretend that they have some kind of special condition which they are preserving. You're not preserving anything if you're not living as a Kehal Jew. And if you're not a Kehal Jew, guess what? There's some good news for you. The good news is that there is an eternal gospel, an eternal doctrine, which is available for everybody who is not a Jew. It's called Universal Judaism or Judaism for all. You can call it Noahide Judaism. And that's basically Judaism as it applies to Noahides. And that's what we promote on this channel. Now, Edom basically means all those apostate Jews, people who've left behind the Kehillah ways, or people who are still calling themselves Kehillah Jews, but they have left behind the ways of the Kehillah and they're trying to rewrite the rules and invent a new kind of Judaism. Also, Edom, red, these are the red Jews. Edom means red. They're the ones who may still have the sort of social aspect of Judaism. Judaism was always supposed to be a social religion. It was basically the Hebrews were brought out of Egypt and were given a labor standards act at Mount Sinai that helped them never fall into slavery again. And a lot of Jews will continue to hold on to this core principle of Judaism even after they've left behind Judaism and they've become atheists or secular humanists in different ways. We could still call them Edom. They're the red Jews. Edom was a Jew. He was circumcised on the 8th day. He went to the same yeshiva as his brother, according to Jewish tradition. They had the same education, but in the end, Edom turned away from the religion. Jacob carried on with the religion, and that was the difference between them. So, in the modern world, we can call them the red Jews, the ones who turned their back on the religious aspect, or you can say the ceremonial aspect of Judaism, and have focused on the more social aspect, became socialists or even communists. Trotsky would be a perfect example of one of those. They were very influential in the rise of Bolshevism and the Russian Revolution and the development of communism in the 20th century. And so we promote proto-socialism for such people, for Edom, which is what Engels referred to when he said that the Anabaptists were proto-communists. They were a perfect example of an early communist society. And Anabaptists, of course, being Bible believers and having a constitution from the Bible, unlike Calvinists and Lutherans and Roman Catholics and all the Orthodox churches, the Anabaptists, their constitution is the New Testament. Whatever it says, that's how it is for them. So they tend to call themselves sojourners, which is a translation of the biblical term ger, or might call themselves pilgrims, which is again another translation of the biblical term ger. And ger is, in modern Judaic sort of lingo, translated as Noahide. So it's the same thing. So the Anabaptists were Noahides, and that's the proto-socialism of the Noahides, which was praised by the founders of communism, of 20th century communism, what turned out to be 20th century communism. The founders, of course, were all in the 19th century. But that system has a lot of people who were would have been categorized as Hebrew according to the biblical interpretation of it, and including, the the scribal and pharisaical interpretation where we talk about Ishmael and Edom not being Jacob, not being Israelites. They're not Israel, but they are still Hebrews. They're children of Abraham, and they're part of the broader Abrahamic family. Edom, of course, the brother of Jacob. Ishmael, the uncle of Jacob, all part of the Abrahamic family, and Abraham was called a Hebrew, so all of them are Hebrews. So Edom in Judaism sort of symbolizes Christianity or apostate Jews, and Ishmael symbolizes Noahides, and all together are one big happy Hebrew family. Supposed to be, but as you see, they keep on fighting because of false religion, which has divided us into different sects when we should be one religion, to be honest, one sojourner religion or pilgrim religion. And I wanted to talk about one of those sojourners or pilgrims in this sort of red Judaic context, where you have people who have abandoned Judaism but are still holding on to prime sort of fundamental principles and are praising the Anabaptists as proto-socialists. Some examples would be Engels would be included in this. He would have been grafted into that movement. And then, of course, Lenin was grafted into the same movement. And then Stalin was also grafted into the same movement. So this is possible to see them all as part of the same general movement of Edom, an Edomic movement. And today I'm going to be defending Stalin a bit, but not because I'm a fan of the guy, but I do think that we need to be objective. And if you're going to be in the modern world, people like you to take a side, and they try to have a sort of sympathy for the devil sort of approach. And people are defending Hitler. And I thought, well, it's about time somebody took the side to play devil's advocate for Stalin. So let's have a look and see what we can do with Stalin. I mean, it is an easier job immediately. It should jump off the page if you start reading this. It's much easier to sympathize with Stalin, what he did, and to defend his approach than it is to do so for Hitler. And yet people are doing that with Hitler and the Nazis. So it's really time that we started to do that with Stalin and the Bolsheviks. So let's get into this and see what we can say about poor old Stalin, and see if he is as bad as we are led to believe in the modern day. In the modern day, we might be inclined to believe the propaganda that we're brought up with. We hear all the time the bad news about the communists and the Bolsheviks and the USSR, the Soviet Union, and Stalin. We hear all about, and we just take it for granted. It's like, okay, fine, yeah, that's how it was. And I have to tell you, I'm a bachelor of Russian and East European studies. I have the degree with honors, cum laude, in Russian and East European studies. And I have a grandfather who was in a gulag, who was actually a prisoner of Stalin's in the gulag. He escaped, and I should have never looked at the other side. I should never have looked at things from Stalin's point of view, except that the Russian East European studies background really helped me to start seeing things. Of course, at first, from a very sort of critical sort of journalist's negative eye, on the situation with my family background, I should have probably maintained my critical negative stance towards Stalin and the Bolsheviks and the communists for a very long time. But then I became interested in my sort of early adulthood. I became interested in my Judaic origins, in Judaism, and started to learn about morality and importance of civility, the importance of community and society, building a good, strong Jewish community and being a member of a community. And I can honestly say that if I hadn't gone through that, I would still be properly critical of the USSR, the Soviet Union, and Stalin. And yet, you'd think, well, having gone through a religious Judaic sort of experience, that I would be even more anti-Stalin and anti-communism, anti-Soviet Union. But in fact, the evidence just doesn't allow me to do so. Not in the modern world. When you look around you at the secular society we live in, and how debauched and how depraved and how hedonistic it is, And then you look at how the Soviets were extremely concerned about cracking down on bourgeois hedonism and depravity. You start to think, well, what was exactly wrong with these guys? I mean, okay, they had a heavy hand on everything. They were very harsh in the way they dealt with things. But from an Orthodox Judaic perspective, they did pretty well as a bunch of goyim, as a bunch of non-Jews who were trying to maintain a social, a civilized, moral society. You're not required to be a believer in God as a non-Jew according to Judaism. You just have to uphold the 7 principles of civilization. That is the Noahide laws, the covenant of Noah, Sheva Mitzvot. And the Soviet Union did that. They were not blasphemers, they were not idolaters, because they didn't believe in using God's name for their own selfish purposes. They never used God's name as an excuse to do what they do. That's what blasphemers do. They use God's name all the time, say, oh, God wants you to give me some money for my private jet, or God wants you to give us some money so we can build an imitation temple in Brazil. Ridiculous, frivolous ideas that people throw their money at these churches for, so that they can, increase their social media channel, or increase their popularity as an evangelical Christian channel on the TV or something like that, or have their pastors fly around the world trying to convince people to give them more money that they need to fly around the world to get more money to fly around the world. It's this kind of circular thing. It's like, it's pretty evil, really. What they're doing is blasphemy. They're using God's name and religion as an excuse to get you to give them money. And some places, in other places, they use God's name as an excuse to get you to kill yourselves in the name of God. We have examples of that happening, of course, in Islamic societies, where you have Islamist terrorists among them, who are saying, you have to blow yourselves up in the name of God, or kill in the name of God. Killing in the name of God is a big one. And then you've got also in modern state of Israel, where you have a lot of Jews who are sort of hypnotized into the secular nationalist approach of things, thinking that they have to also kill in the name of God, because that's all they have left, and God for them has become the Jewish state, and they have to kill in the name of that. And this is all blasphemy. It's all blasphemy. But atheists don't do that. They don't believe in God, so they don't use God's name as an excuse to do anything. That's the first thing there. So they're not guilty of blasphemy, and they're not guilty of idolatry, because they don't set up idols of stone and wood and silver and gold and worship them, things that are made of their own hands, and then bow down and worship these statues. They don't do things like that. So they're free from that. So what else is there on the 7 laws of Noah? There's murder, there's sexual immoralities, there's theft, there is cruelty to animals, and there is justice. Okay, you have to fight for justice. Well, fighting for justice is why these revolutions start in the first place. Murder, you can say, well, there was lots of killing going on, but murder is not the same as execution. Murder is a lawless, individualist decision to execute somebody that you don't like for your own personal reasons. Execution is a state-imposed system where there are laws and there is a trial and there is a procedure you have to go through. It's part of the rule of law. So execution doesn't come under the category of murder. Murder is very much an individualist act. It can be a group of people involved in murdering, assassinating somebody, but it is the main thing is that there is a breach of law. There's no legal sort of process of execution being involved. Okay, so even if you just had a group of people who had a coup against a member of their government who was exploiting his or her power, and they had a summary execution of the person, that would still come under execution rather than murder. But murder would very much be an individual or a small group of people who decided that this person was standing in their way, and they wanted to have something or just take revenge on that person, or they were just psychopaths and they had their own peculiar reason for wanting to kill somebody. So murder is something which civilized societies crack down on, and it might be that a civilized society employs capital punishment in order to crack down on murderers, but that doesn't make the state into a murderer when they're cutting down on murderers. So murder is something, again, which the Soviet Union was against. Theft, of course, they were against that. They were against theft and exploitation of workers as well. You can say, well, didn't they, steal all the money of all the wealthy and redistribute it amongst the poor so that everybody held all things in common? And you say, yes, but that is not necessarily theft. That's restoring to the people what is rightfully theirs if they were being treated correctly under a proper Labor Standards Act, for example, like the Torah, as it is defined in the Torah. There are certain things which rights that people and workers have. And if somebody has accumulated wealth on the back of ignoring such laws, ignoring such rights of the workers, then that person is a thief. And everything they have accumulated must be taken away from them and given back to the people who it was taken from. And if those people are dead, then it should go to their descendants or to people who are in a like situation. So theft is something which, again, the Russian Revolution was trying to correct the situation, and they did not take kindly to anybody who stole from the state or from the people. Thieves after that were dealt with extremely harshly. So social justice, they fought for justice. And the last thing you'll say is cruelty to animals. The strictest definition, or the simplest definition of this cruelty to animals business, is basically don't eat anything which is still alive. Min chai is the phrase. Don't eat anything which is basically still alive, or hasn't been slaughtered properly, or is butchered while it's still alive. And the system of slaughtering which took place in the Soviet Union was to bleed things to death. And that is the biblical way. They didn't change it. That's the way that was introduced to Christian believers in Europe in the early days, based on the Book of Acts, that they were not allowed to eat strangled meat, and it became part of culture, and it didn't change during the Soviet Union. Although things have changed now after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that didn't change. So according to the fundamental level of that law, they observed that as well. So it was a Noahide society. And then, since it was a Noahide society, we might as well look at Stalin and say, okay, what did he do to make this Noahide society so unpleasant that the whole world criticizes him and the Soviet Union now? I mean, it's not round, so we can't objectively put it under a microscope and study and observe it right now. But and I was a graduate in Russian and East European studies in 1996. So it was just during the sort of the chaotic collapse of the Soviet Union and the fallout on all the civil wars which were happening at that time. I went to Siberia and I studied things firsthand. Amazingly, I survived. I don't know how I did that. Just that's the the joy of ignorance, I suppose. My father opposed me on this, but I wanted to get a good result for my degree, and so I went and I did my own independent research in West Siberia, and I saw things as it was falling apart. So I saw things at their worst, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I was surprised. One of the things which struck me immediately was how many people were saying, things were better in the olden days. A lot of old people saying things were better under Stalin. Gorbachev was a madman. He destroyed the whole thing. And I was thinking, wow, but Gorbachev's so amazing from the Western point of view. We think he's a superhero. This is back in 1996, those of you who are too young to know such things. He was really regarded as something very special. But there was a lot of resent for the man, and I couldn't understand it, because I had learned and studied the Soviet Union from a Western point of view, through the goggles of Western propaganda. So I wasn't seeing things objectively. I guess maybe all of you have got these days. You've got one of those friends you've got a friend who is just asks ChatGPT all the questions and gives you answers all the time, and you can actually read through their text messages or their comments on Facebook or something, and you think to yourself, another ChatGPT article. And I've got one of those too. She doesn't stop sending ChatGPT messages as if they're her own. We know that they are from ChatGPT, and I think she knows that I know that they're from ChatGPT because I mentioned it so many times. So she just takes for granted that I know that. Yet, nevertheless, she still sends me these messages every now and then. So she says that she's interested in Stalin these days, and she's trying to work out about, who the guy was. And of course, her only source for researching this is basically asking ChatGPT questions. Now, we have to think carefully about where ChatGPT is getting. ChatGPT is not programmed to be omniscient, sort of oracle for all information. What it is it's a language model. It's a language program which has been educated on millions and millions of conversations, might be potentially billions of conversations available through the internet, basically just through any kind of web search. Billions of conversations online, and of course, it's an English language ChatGPT in English. So whatever the English audience of the world is talking about, and their comments or the conversations are available online to be searched and looked at on forums, Wikipedia discussion pages, and things like that. Whatever is available there is the training data for ChatGPT. It does not mean that ChatGPT has a hand on what is factually true and what is not true. All it means is that ChatGPT will tell you, in summary, a good impression of what people are saying. Okay, and this is very, very different from knowing the facts of the matter. But we're going to look at the messages. I'm just going to read out some messages that my friend sent, so we can understand where she starts from with her ideas about Stalin and where things are going wrong. This is just a summary of what people are saying in the English language, internet about Stalin, Joseph Stalin. So the first paragraph we have, okay, and if people pop in and listen to me saying this while I'm reading it out, they'll think that this is the content of the video rather than the criticism. But let's read it through. The first thing that message she says is that it says this: Joseph Stalin is widely criticized for his authoritarian rule, which relied on fear, propaganda, and the brutal suppression of dissent. His leadership saw millions of deaths due to forced collectivization, the Great Purge, and the use of labor camps like the Gulag. Policies such as this collectivization of agriculture led to devastating famines, including the Holodomor in Ukraine, while industrialization came at a significant human cost. Stalin's cult of personality stifled intellectual freedom, and his paranoia led to widespread purges of both real and perceived enemies. Religious and cultural groups faced persecution, and his policies fostered a legacy of fear and oppression. While Stalin industrialized the Soviet Union, his leadership prioritized power over human life, leaving a legacy of suffering and betrayal of socialist ideals. And that's basically a good summary of millions of English language conversations on the internet, available through the internet, on what people are saying in the English language about Stalin. That's basically it. But if we go through that, just these words pop out as us that we hear: criticized, authoritarian, fear, propaganda, brutal, deaths, forced, purge, devastating famines, and human cost, cult of personality, stifling, paranoia, and persecution, and fear, again, oppression, and power over human life, suffering, betrayal. That's the content of what people are saying. But when we look at those words, just as a list of words, negative words about this man, means people did not like this man. They have these criticisms. I'm afraid of him. Oh, he's authoritarian. But you know what? You can use these. He persecutes such and such. You can use these words against anybody you don't like. If you have people who are in a marriage who are breaking up, they get divorced, and one side can use all of that language against the other person, it doesn't mean the other person is Stalin, right? But if it doesn't mean the other person is Stalin, maybe it also means that Stalin isn't Stalin. Let's have a look again at that little passage that we read out. What is the fact that we get? What did Stalin achieve? What did he do, actually? And in this little passage that we read out just now, all we get is two things. One, collectivization of agriculture, and industrialized the Soviet Union. Two things. He collectivized agriculture and industrialized the Soviet Union. And the rest is just, and we didn't like him for it. And we didn't like the way he did it. But we should look at the situation of what actually was happening at that time and what he was handed and what he had to deal with. The Russian Empire was huge. It was absolutely massive. There was nothing as big as the Russian Empire since Genghis Khan's empire, the Mongol Empire. There was nothing like it. It covered all of northern Asia, part of North America as well. Alaska was part of it, and it covered most of the landmass of Europe as well. It went all. I mean, if you look at the landmass of Europe, you will see it went all the way from the Ural Mountains to Poland. It included Poland. That was part of it at the time. It was absolutely insanely huge. There's never been an empire like that, a land empire like that. Never. People say, well, the British Empire covered, Britannia ruled the waves. It was the biggest empire because it covered over this. Yes, but not really. In terms of landmass, it wasn't that huge. It was certainly vast in terms of covering the entire globe, but it was a empire of the sea, really. And the Soviet Union was an empire, a landmass empire. The Russian Empire was a landmass empire. And the Russian Empire, you had elite groups like the royal family, the Tsars themselves, the emperors and the emperors' supporters in the nobility, who were thriving and living in absolute insane levels of luxury at the expense of the peasants, who were struggling to survive in mud. They were in total abject poverty and being exploited more. Women and children had no rights at all, and men had a right to be basically conscripted to be serving in an army, and that's basically it. You didn't own anything. You were completely exploited. And it got to the point where, of course, inevitably, when you have such an unfair society with such a few at the top taking off the cream from the entire empire, that there's a lot of dissent, there's a lot of anger, and a revolution was inevitable. There was going to be a revolution. And the Bolsheviks, the early communists, they harnessed this dissent, this bubbling sort of trouble, and they channeled it into a communist revolution. They channeled it into communist revolution, which is a good thing too. I'll explain why. Because if they hadn't, there would have been an overthrow of power, and there would have simply been another despot come to power, followed by decades of people in poverty still, even worse than before, with a complete collapse of society, a complete collapse of social structure, a complete collapse of any kind of law and order, and eventually a strong tyrant would come into power and establish his new dynasty, the new royal family, which would continue to exploit the people in the end. That's what happens. But the Soviet Union would also, the Russian Empire would have also collapsed because the new leader would not have been able to hold together that much land and that many different nationalities under one empire. And that's what happens when we see, for example, the successors to the Mongol Empire. It collapses. It breaks up. The empires which are so big and established over centuries, sometimes of a particular dynasty, culminating in one particular leader who, when he dies, the empire breaks up into pieces. And that's what was going to happen to the Russian Empire. It would have been thrown into turmoil. People would have been going at war with each other, and there would have been more deaths than you could possibly imagine. But what happened instead is that the Bolsheviks took control, and they actually managed to hold the whole thing together. That's pretty insane for a start. That's achievement number one. They held it together. Because these people were not ignorant. They were highly educated. And if you want to understand how educated they are, you should read the writings of Stalin himself. People say, oh, he's just a thug. He was a street urchin, something like that. He was a brutal gang leader, and he got into power. No, read his writings. Just go and read the collective works of Stalin and work out. You'll see very, very quickly that this was no ignorant peasant. This was an extremely highly educated man. And that's a side of Stalin we have never, ever seen depicted in any portrayal of the Soviet Union. They have never portrayed him as a super intellectual, which is what he clearly was from his writings. Likewise, Lenin. They do say, well, Lenin, we can't ignore that he was an intellectual. He was an intellectual. He was a super intellectual too. And somehow this handful of intellectuals, Trotsky, Lenin, Stalin, and the whole group of those Bolshevik leaders somehow managed to harness the Russian Revolution and steer it in such a way that actually people were very, very happy in the 1920s. People were feeling liberated and it was okay. But disaster was looming. Disaster was looming. Because you can't have that kind of a transition where everybody is now basically free from the oppressor. People have to get back to work. People have to keep the farms going. Natural disasters come along. Famines are going to happen, and people have to be able to pull together to get through such times. Now, in the past, the cities would have been fine. The wealthy in the cities would have been okay, and the peasants and the poor in the cities would have been starving to death, and nobody would have turned a second glance to see them starving in the streets. But under the Soviet Union, things had to be better now. Things had to be improved. And once Lenin had died, there was a necessity for somebody who was going to take control and make sure the whole thing wasn't going to fall apart. They needed a strong leader who was going to make hard decisions in order to make sure that the whole society did not collapse into utter chaos and lawlessness and gang warfare and everything else. They had to somehow keep it all together. Things were fraying at the seams. There was not enough food to go around. They did not want to fall into debt with Western powers or Western countries. So they needed to be able to generate food and jobs and industry among themselves. And they had to turn a peasant society of the Russian Empire into a fully industrialized modern society. And that is no small feat, okay? So although we read that little passage and it had a lot of criticism for Stalin there, the two things it mentioned was collectivization and industrialization in the Soviet Union. And that is the main task. You've got to, when you it's very easy to sit in your armchair and criticize people and say, well, he's a rubbish leader who's doing. Well, it's very difficult to say, well, why don't you take his job? There are a billion people out there who will say, I'm not going to do that. I couldn't make that decision. But those billion people are also the loudest mouth people and saying, well, that person is doing bad. It's very easy for them to criticize, but they themselves would never lift a finger to help. They sit there criticizing in the comfort of their armchairs without actually ever thinking about what's involved in controlling such a massive society in such a way that it can be productive and the majority of people can survive in such a terrible transition. So collectivization was the idea that we are going to have all property owned by the state so that everybody can benefit from that property, whether it's a farmland, whether it's an industry, a factory, whatever it is, it's all going to be state-owned, and everybody will benefit from it. Everybody who is a member of the society, every citizen will benefit from that. But when people were having the revolution, a lot of the peasants who owned a lot of land or controlled a lot of land were being taxed. Usually, they were taxed to the hilt by the imperial powers, the nobility, and they didn't have a chance to benefit from these huge farms or plots of land that they owned. They were basically just farming it for the lords, for the landlords, I suppose, and paying their taxes off to the imperial government. So they joined in the revolution thinking, I can finally get the use of my land. This is my land. I want to use it. I want to farm it. I want to be able to become wealthy like that lord over there. I want to be a lord of the land. I don't want to have to just give everything that I keep on growing off of my land, all the produce going to them, and I'm not making anything out of it. I'm still a peasant. Okay. So these landowning peasants, or the peasants who were in control of farming the land, of course they joined in the revolution. They were happy to join in the revolution, but after the revolution, they wanted the benefit of their land. They wanted to get rid of the old power structures, but they wanted the benefit of the land that they had liberated. Okay, that the revolution had led to the liberation of this land, and they wanted to benefit from that. So they were not happy when the communists started saying, well, this now is going to be serving the people. The people are going to be benefiting from this land, and you're not going to be the owner of this land. It's like, well, no, screw you. This is my land. I fought for this land to have freedom from the Tsar and the the bourgeoisie. Now you're going to take it away from me as well? I'm not going to stand for that. And you can understand that. I understand that very, very well. Essentially, it's very similar to my own grandfather's life when he was a child and his family. My great grandfather and my great grandmother, they were in that sort of situation. They were not peasants; they were lower level ability. They were happy when a revolution came along, but they were definitely not happy when the revolution wanted to take the property off their hands. They were not going along with that, and so they broke off from the revolutionary army. They broke away from them, took a different side. Thank you very much for getting rid of the oppressive royalty. Now we'll take it from here. We don't need to participate or join in with your social project. Thank you very much. That's as the line they wanted to draw, and I thought that was fine. I understand that totally. I thought that was fine. I was brought up to think that's totally fine. As Pilsudski said, I took the train of communism to the station called Independent Poland, and now I'm getting off. Thank you very much. That was basically the end of socialism for many people in West Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, and Poland. But that's not so easy, When you've got the Bolsheviks in control, they say, no, this is a socialist project. Our project is not to just overthrow the Tsar and get rid of the nobility so that you, who own a lot of land, are going to be able to benefit from that. Our project is to make sure that everybody now gets a piece of the pie. Everybody gets a slice of the cake. Okay, everybody is going to have something out of this. Everybody is going to all own all things in common. There's a lot of biblical phrases used in the socialist and communist project, and those verses are taken from chapter 2, chapter 4, chapter 5 from the book of Acts, where they shared all things in common. That was going to be the way it is, and that's what collectivization is, sharing all things in common. So no, as a peasant who's now liberated from the oppression of the Russian nobility, you are not now the owner of your own land and allowed to get sole benefit of that land. That land belongs to all the people involved in this social project. Everybody is going to own that land. We're going to own all things in common. And if you can't get with that program, then you are now an enemy of the state. And they called such people who didn't want to get with the socialist project after the revolution, they called them kulaks. Okay, a kulak is basically a peasant who had a huge amount of land, agricultural land, and was very happy to be involved in the revolution against the Russian nobility, but wasn't prepared to share all things in common with the rest of the Soviet society after the revolution. Well, those people became enemies of the state very quickly, and they had to be dealt with. If they were happy to join in with the socialist project to feed the masses who needed food, because their famine was on the way, if they were happy to do so, then they would be included, and they would say, sure, no problem, come along, my farm is your farm, it belongs to everybody, there is no mine, it's ours. And they were brought in, and they got rewards and honors in the Communist Party. And those kulaks who said, no, this is my land, I'm not going to share this with you, this is my family's land, we've been here for hundreds of years, and it's mine. They were enemies of the state. They were thrown into the gulags, which was basically a re-education center, where they were hopefully re-educated to learn about the values, socialist values, the importance of communism. And if they were reformed, they were let out. And if they were not reformed, they rotted and died in the gulag sometimes. My grandfather escaped from the gulag, and he managed to get across Central Asia, eventually got through Tehran and to Bombay and to South Africa, and eventually made it to the United Kingdom, where he stayed and joined then the British military in fighting against the Nazis. Okay, so that was a very unique situation with my grandfather. Most people didn't escape. They were either re-educated and released, or they died in the gulags, or sometimes eventually the gulag was turned into just a center, like for example in Vorkuta, it became the center of a new community, and new communities grew around it and turned into towns and then into cities. And Vorkuta is an example of that situation. When there was no need to imprison them anymore, and people were not so serious about re-educating. Everybody knew about communism. There was no threat to communism, so they relaxed the policies on those gulags, and they were allowed to just start producing. So civilization survived, and these places turned into bases of new towns. So the kulak was an enemy of the state. And another example is in the towns, you would have people who were of the petty nobility, the petty bourgeoisie, who may have been happy to be involved in the socialist revolution. Again, this is more like my side of the family. My family is more like this side of the coin. Who were happy to be involved in the revolution. They had huge manor houses or townhouses or gigantic apartments in major cities, and they were very happy to be involved in the revolution to get rid of the upper nobility and the higher royals, so that they could enjoy more freedom and not have to face the sort of petty keeping up appearances that they had to do all the time. And they would then, their apartments, they would get a knock on the door and somebody would say, you've got a grand apartment here, it's big enough to house 10 families. And the next day there would be 10 families in their apartment. Say these were people who had no homes, they were homeless peasants in the town. Now they're going to be living with you here. This is so, divide up your apartment appropriately, build brick walls as you like. This is now been taken over by the people. And many of them were, okay, fine, that's no problem. I'm completely subscribed to the socialist project. I'm very, very keen to, house the homeless. And others were like, screw you, this is my house, this is my family house. We're not going to share this with anybody. And they were the ones who were sent to the gulags again, okay? Because not everybody who wanted to get rid of the royalty was really a full subscriber to the socialist project, which was fundamentally to share all things in common, to hold all things in common. So Stalin was actually the one who was continuing this project with regards to agricultural property. The towns and the cities had already had the nobility forced to share their apartments or their townhouses with people who were less fortunate. That was all settled in the time of Lenin. But the agricultural situation was not all settled, and it was Stalin who had to continue the work in that department. And that's why the collectivization of agriculture is always attributed to Stalin. And as a result, the Holodomor, which is the famine in Ukraine, was also attributed to him too. It is inevitable that there are going to be a lot of people dying. Stalin's attitude towards who should we save and who should be allowed to die was based on one principle only. If they want to be involved with the socialist project, they are saving themselves. If they don't want to be involved in the socialist project, they're doing us a favor by dying. That's essentially his criteria. Now, that's very harsh. Of course, that's very harsh. But the situation was otherwise. Everybody across the Soviet Union is going to starve. And there's going to be hundreds of millions of people starving to death. It's going to be a complete collapse. And the whole country is going to be torn to pieces by other powers. Britain's going to take a piece. China is going to take a piece. Japan is going to take a piece. Everybody's going to take a piece of this pie. America may come in to the East Siberia and take a piece of Chukotka. Everybody was going to take a piece of it. So, because there would be so much famine and death, and there would be a complete collapse of society. So Stalin had to make a decision. And the decision was, if they don't want to be involved, let them die. We're not interested in them. That's why you have strange, photographs of the Holodomor. You'll see, for example, like a babushka, an old lady walking down the street, looking quite plump and comfortable, and next to her on the floor, starving to death or dead, is it like a young man? It's like, well, how did the young man starve to death and this old lady is okay? What's going on here? And the answer is very simple. That old lady was willing to share everything she had with everybody, but that young man wasn't willing to get a job and join in. That's all there was to it. He was an alcoholic. She was a communal thinker. So the communal thinkers survived, and the individualists were allowed to die because they were not involved in the socialist project. And if they not want to be involved, they let them die. And that's why you had 6 million people dying in the famine. So they were people who were, and we're talking about over hundreds of millions of people across the whole of the USSR. They were people who were not going to get involved. There were no death camps set up for those people. They weren't interred. They weren't forced into labor. They simply didn't want to get involved in the project, and so they starved to death. While others, old ladies even, were not starving to death because they shared everything they had and they were involved in the project. It's a very different situation. You look at Hitler's decision on who should die and who should live, based on a very different principle. In Stalin's situation, there was a simple decision that if you were not going to be involved, then you could be allowed to die. If you're going to be involved, you were saving yourselves. Whereas in Hitler's situation, it's like, well, we need to just keep on expanding, because as long as we're expanding, we're going to be okay. We're going to be exploiting those people who were conquered. The conquered nations are basically serving us. Anybody from the conquered nation who agrees with us can join in as long as they are of a particular kind of human being, a particular type of phenotype, and then they can join in with us. But if they're of the wrong phenotype, they were born with the wrong physical condition or the wrong grandparents, then they were going to be killed or turned into slaves. This is very, very evil way of deciding. Now, sure, he also led to the death of 6 million people, but his project was based on some very strange ideology of who should live and who should die, based on who your parents were, who your grandparents were, what did you look like, and whether you wanted to join in the Nazi ideology. Now, Hitler and Stalin have something in common in that Stalin also says, if they want to join in with our socialist ideology, they are one of us and we are going to protect them. If they don't want to join in, let them die. It was indiscriminate, let them die. There's no discrimination. You could be Russian, you could be Ukrainian, you could be Kazakh, you could be Georgian. It didn't matter. You could be Mongolian, you could be Chukchi. It didn't matter what you were. If you were joining in, you could be Jewish. If you're joining in, no problem. If you were not interested in joining in, then you were basically shooting yourself in the foot. And that was Stalin's criteria. Completely different from Hitler's, where it was basically you must be of a kind of human being that we define as Aryan. And if you're not defined by the Nazi definition of Aryan, then you have no right to live. Your only right is to be a slave for those people who do fit our definition of Aryan. And if you are an enemy to us, then also you have no right to live. So we're just going to expand, conquer. And every time as long as we're expanding and conquering, the people back home don't have to worry about food. And we can kill you because you're an enemy. And if we have succeeded in conquering you and you've taken our side, then okay, you can be a collaborator as long as you don't have these particular features, family features that we define as making you Untermensch, I mean subhumans. That's a very different criteria. Both of them made a decision on who should live and who should die. When push comes to shove, I have to side with Stalin. I cannot possibly side with Hitler. I cannot possibly side with Hitler and say he made a good decision on who should live and who should die. But when you look at the situation with Stalin on who should live and who should die, I have to side with him and say, well, I wouldn't have wanted to make that decision. I couldn't have made that decision, but I know there are billions of people out there who can't make such a decision, and there are very few people out there who have the leadership required to make that decision and basically make the decision based on fair rule. If you want to join in and share your product and be a contributor to the survival of our state, our country, the USSR, Soviet Socialist Republics, United Soviet Socialist Republics. If you want to join in, then no problem. But if you are going to fight against the survival of our state, then we're not going to imprison you. When you're basically shooting yourself in the foot, and nobody's going to come and help you, so you can starve to death. It's pretty harsh, but I have to take the side of that. I have to take the side of that because it's a fair approach. It's a fair approach, and it's also based on the idea of holding all things in common. So then I'll go a little bit more. I don't want to go on too long, but I'll go on a little bit more about some of the things which are said by this ChatGPT's sort of friend who uses ChatGPT. They do list the things which were useful. ChatGPT does list. My friend who's sending me this comment does list things which were useful in the Soviet Union. For example, the rapid industrialization, universal education, full employment, economic equality, support for science and technology, social welfare, cultural development, global influence. This is a very good list of things which were achieved by Stalin at the time. Very, very good list of things. But there are also a lot of negative things. But the negativity is really just we didn't like him. We didn't like the way he did it. We didn't like the fact that there was such a cost of human life. We didn't like the fact that he made a decision on who should live and who should die based on whether they wanted to join in and participate or not. And I'm sorry, it doesn't sound very nice that you join us or die is what it comes across as. But we mustn't allow it to be boiled down to such a join us or die. They were not literally shooting you in the head if you didn't join them. It was literally, here is a lifeboat floating down your street. Jump in and do things according to the rules of this lifeboat. Otherwise, you are going to drown. That's how it was. That's how we have to view what Stalin did. The lifeboat was going down the flooded streets, if you like. Okay, this is a metaphor, the allegory. The lifeboat was going down the flooded streets. Jump in the lifeboat and do as you are told, and you will be fine. We will look after you, and we will give you all of those things. You will get the rapid industrialization, the universal education, full employment, economic equality, support for science and technology, social welfare, cultural development, and we will have a global influence. But if you do not get into this lifeboat as it is going down the streets, you will die. That's the way it's got to be presented. And when you present it like that, you say, well, it was very harsh of him to force it like this. What else was he supposed to do? You can criticize as much as you like from your armchair. What else was he supposed to do? And then the criticism will come back, well, you're just part of the Stalin personality cult. That's all it'll come back to. Your part is the personality cult. You can't find anything wrong with the man. No, I can find plenty wrong with the man. But as a leader who successfully did all this for the Soviet Union, I can't really say that I could have done better. And if you put me into his shoes, I will also have to make that decision. They can say, look, the situation is this. We're facing hundreds of millions of deaths across the USSR. We're facing hundreds of millions of deaths. What are we going to do? What is the decision? Well, I'm also going to have to make a decision on who should live and who should die. I'm going to have to make that decision. And who would you decide should live and should die? Who would you decide? You have to make that decision. If it's you sitting in that place, you have to make the decision. You say, well, I couldn't. What if you're forced into the situation? Well, I'll just resign. Okay, and allow another 10 weeks of wasted time for another leader to come into power. And meanwhile, throughout those 10 weeks, more millions and millions of people are dying. You are responsible for the deaths of everybody who is going to die if you refuse to take the job today. You can't escape being responsible for deaths by saying, oh, I don't want the responsibility. I don't want the job. I don't want the job. Give it to somebody else. Because you didn't take a leadership decision at that time, those millions of people are now dying because of you. You're still guilty. The blood is still on your hands. You can't say, I'm not going to do it. So now make a decision and decide who lives and who dies. And I think I would have said the same thing. I was, well, okay, everybody who's involved with the socialist project lives, and everybody who doesn't want to get involved, we're not going to kill them, but they will die. I would have probably made exactly the same decision. I hope that I would make the same decision. I wouldn't just say, well, let's just go around and get rid of all the drug addicts, for example. Let's just kill all the drug addicts. That'll solve it. Let's kill all the alcoholics and the drug addicts because they're useless. They're not contributing to society. That might be the first thing which would jump to my mind. I hope that I would have made a decision like Stalin and said, well, look, everybody who wants to be involved in the project, they should be, they're saving themselves, and everybody who doesn't want to be involved, they're going to die. I hope that I would make that decision as good as well as Stalin did. It's not a personality cult, but they'll always say, "Oh well, if you were defending him, you're part of the personality cult." And what is the list of criticisms you'll get against him are always like this empty, hollow words of just criticism with no full or clear sort of explanation. So another thing that popped up is, what about Stalin? Wasn't he anti-Semitic? Now, Stalin established the first Jewish state, which had been known since Khazaria for 1,000 years. Since the end of the Khazar Empire, the first Jewish state was established by Stalin. It's called the Jewish Autonomous Region, and the capital of that area is Birobidzhan. And you can see the flag of that region is on our channel page. Those 7 colored rainbows standing for the 7 laws of Noah, which was the fundamental principle of the Birobidzhan region, the Jewish or Hebrew Autonomous Republic. Stalin established that. He gave that land to them. It's bigger than the land of Israel, by the way. If you calculate the land mass, it's about equal, but it's a little bit bigger than the land of Israel. And Stalin appointed that. He also allowed his children to marry Jews. At least 2 of them married Jews. One of the relationships didn't work out, but those people were not disappeared by Stalin because he didn't want his children to marry them. And people say that Stalin would disappear anybody he disapproved of, but no, he didn't disappear the people that his children wanted to marry. He approved of the marriage, and they had official weddings, socialist weddings. So no, he wasn't anti-Semitic, but he may have said things which sounded anti-Semitic because he was from a time when people didn't think very carefully about what was considered offensive by the things they said. We say, what about the doctor's plot? He arrested 12 doctors and executed 12 people. He arrested 12 doctors because of the doctor's plot at the end. Well, the doctor's plot was really Khrushchev's project. When Khrushchev came into power later, he said that the doctor's plot was non-existent, and he dismissed all mention of it. He outlawed that and covered it up. But it was really his project was to try and get at Beria. Beria was an evil piece of work and very nasty piece of work. And that was one of Stalin's weaknesses, was that he trusted Beria. We can absolutely say that Stalin was an idiot for trusting Beria and to pay so much attention to what Beria had to say and to value Beria's opinion so much. This was idiotic of Stalin, and was narrow-minded because Stalin was a Georgian, and so was Beria. And he trusted Beria because he was a Georgian, probably. I imagine that's more likely the case. We can't say for certain, but I think he probably trusted Beria because he was also a Georgian, and the 2 Georgians stuck together in the Bolshevik party. So that was, I think, one of Stalin's problems. And trusting Beria led to a lot of problems. Beria was the one who led the repressions and disappearances, and had all sorts of horrific things going on, which Stalin didn't investigate and didn't allow anybody to investigate. Beria was doing a good job as far as Stalin was concerned. Their problems were disappearing and everything was fine. So he didn't want to hear any criticism of Beria. But the rest of the Soviet party knew that Beria was a serious problem and they had to get rid of him. Khrushchev led the idea of trying to get rid of Beria through the doctors. Beria then told Stalin that there were a bunch of Jewish doctors who were trying to assassinate Stalin, and Stalin then got paranoid about it in his last year of his life and was very, very concerned and had a crackdown on Jewish doctors. I think 12 were executed. And then, of course, Stalin died. Then the Soviets executed Beria, summary execution on the spot on the same day that Stalin died. And then the doctor's plot was brushed on the carpet. It never happened, and it was all cleared up afterwards. There was no such thing. So there was this issue of the doctor's plot towards the end of Stalin's life, and that did lead to a crackdown on people that Stalin thought were a problem. But was he anti-Jewish? No, he didn't. He promoted a Yiddish culture. He allowed his children to marry Jews. He established the first Jewish state. He was supportive of the Jewish state of Israel in the 1940s when it was established. He actually supported the idea. And only later did he become suspicious of it, and that was because he was listening to Beria in his old age, and the in the end, he died in the same year after about 12 months of his persecution there on that situation. That is actually quite comparable to Saul in the Bible, biblical Saul, somebody who was doing good, was a strong leader, but in the end became paranoid and died in as a sort of an enemy of God. And that's the sort of situation we would say with Stalin as well. He actually did a very good job, but in his last year, he succumbed to the whispers of a total psychopath, Beria, and gave in to that and died with a bad name. If he had not given in, I'm sure today that we would be remembering Stalin as a good leader. But because he gave in the last years of his life, we remember him as a bad leader. But I'm certain that if he hadn't given in, the Jewish population around the world would have been saying how great he was, and how much he did for the Jews, and we wouldn't be remembering him as a bad leader. Okay, yes, he continued Lenin's atheistic policies and repressed Jewish religious practices along with all religious institutions. There was indiscriminate suppression of religious institutions. Synagogues were closed and Jewish leaders were targeted. But he supported Yiddish culture. He didn't crush Yiddish culture. And Yiddish is just the central North European word for Jewish. That's the word for Jewish culture. So he supported and promoted Jewish culture. But he, in general, along with oppression or suppression of all religious institutions, he also suppressed Jewish religious institutions as well. And that's going to make all the religious Jews say, well, there, he was an enemy of it. But I would say, look, you've got to look at what he was more interested in. He was more interested in people who were doing like orthopraxy. Remember, Stalin himself was a seminarian. That was his education. He was educated in seminary. He was going to be an Orthodox priest. He saw the problems with the Orthodox Church, things like the fact that rape was not a crime in the Orthodox Church, that women and children were being raped all the time, and it was totally fine. That was not even considered a sin. And Stalin disagreed with such things. And so the first laws, which were implemented when they abolished all the laws of the Russian Empire, were the protection of women and children. Rape was a crime, and the punishment was death for rapists. This is something which should have been done a long time ago. Stalin can be regarded as a kind of a reformer of the Russian Orthodox Church in the same way that Oliver Cromwell was considered a reformer of the Protestant Church in the United Kingdom. Stalin could be regarded the same way. The movement, the Christian movement, which grew out of Stalin's reforms, is called Sergianism, which is a kind of orthodoxy. I think if we look at it that way, that would be correct. He was reforming that, but he had an indiscriminate view that all religion was false religion, unless it was, as it says in the letter of James, chapter 1, verse 27, about supporting the widows and the orphans and being free from the pollution of the capitalist world. That was Stalin's religion. That was what he saw as the true religion. And every other religion needed to be oppressed, suppressed, dismantled, and gotten rid of. And I completely, 100% totally agree with him in that sense. Yeah, the true religion is as described in the letter of James, chapter 1, verse 27. And if it's not like that, it's false religion and needs to be abolished. And anybody who disagrees is just a charlatan who is using God's name for their own personal agendas. That is what it says in 1 James 26. That is what we should do. That's what we have to apply. So I agree with the oppression of religion, which wasn't following those things. And there are plenty of synagogues which were exploiting people. And I don't think that Stalin would have had a problem with reform synagogues. But the Reform synagogues were not across the Soviet Union, mostly Orthodox synagogues, which were really not very Orthodox. They were really just about the Jewish peasants in the Russian Empire wanted to have the equivalent of the Vladika, the Russian Orthodox bishop, and the Muslim cleric, who were regarded as lords, really. And they wanted to have their own kind of religious lords too. And so the rabbi was turned into a sort of religious lord. But this is actually an imitation of Christianity and Islam. It's not the way things were supposed to be in Judaism ever. But that's the way it went, and a lot of these rabbis were exploiting the situation. So I can understand cracking down on that. I think it's good that people should have house churches, and that people should practice in community. I don't think it's terrible that there should be religious hierarchies who are making decisions on people's lives because they believe that they have some direct line with God. This is not right. God is real. God is there. We promote proto-socialism, so we believe in God, we believe in the biblical message, but we don't believe that every word of the Bible is telling us how to behave. We would say that a lot of those passages in the Bible are criticizing people who were supposed to be in positions of authority and were behaving in a terrible way. And the Bible doesn't want us to praise such people because they were God's appointed leaders. The Bible wants us to criticize such people because they were not behaving according to the way as revealed at Mount Sinai. And so, I will agree with the way that he persecuted them. And there is actually a lot more to be said. There's a lot more to be said on this topic. I would hope that I'd be finished by now because it's already past 1 hour. But it seems that this is actually a topic which is going to need a lot more discussion to cover all of the points which I would like to get through. But I think what I've covered today is the at least I've covered the religious aspect. I've covered the industrialization. I mean, it was absolute peasant society and it became a fully industrialized nation at the end of it. I've covered the collectivization. I've covered the difficulty of leadership, choosing who should live and who should die. And I think I'm interested to hear comments. You put your comments below if in response to any of the particular time. Put a timestamp with something I've said. And you said at this point here something, and I would like to respond blah 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 to your comment. I would be interested to hear your comments, but I think I have made a case that Stalin was not as bad as we are led to believe. At least if you are from the religious audience, from a religious point of view, he was not that bad. If you are serious about religion, as in following what the Bible says in James chapter 1, verse 26. But if you're not interested in religion, of course you'll find him to be a very unpleasant person because he was cracking down on bourgeois hedonism and debauchery and depravity, and that might be something that you love and you like. But if you're not into hedonism, depravity, and debauchery, then Stalin was a decent human being who did his best as a leader to establish a properly Noahide society. And there are people today who, and I'm one of them, who would say, come back, Stalin, all is forgiven. Let's have that back because the way the world is going now is just not going the right way. It's falling to pieces. And the right wing are trying to catch everybody every dissenter, every voice of criticism, everybody who wants to go against the grain. The right wing are trying to catch you all up. And I say, no, you know what? The right wing haven't got an answer of who shall live and who should die. Who should live and who should die. And if you listen to their explanation, well, let the refugees die. Let the asylum seekers die. Let them drown in the sea. That's their explanation right now. And the next one, and let the disabled people die. Well, this is just Nazism. That's pure Nazism. No, that is not correct. It should be that everybody, regardless of race, regardless of ability, everybody who is a supporter of the socialist project, they are saving themselves. Let them get into the lifeboat and follow the rules of this lifeboat. Everybody is welcome. And if they don't want to get in the lifeboat, they're shooting themselves in the foot. This is the way we should be doing it. This is the way we can actually save the world in a fair way. We can look back in history and say, they didn't want to get involved. They didn't want to save themselves. There was an indiscriminate invitation to all people, regardless of ability, race, creed. You were all invited to get involved and make a difference. If we look back in ourselves in history, the way we can look back at Stalin's work now and say, yes, it was a horrific time. Yes, millions of people died. But the decision was fair and was just, and everybody had a chance. Don't go down the right wing side of things and think, oh, well, we just make an arbitrary decision on who can live and who can die based on where they're from or their ability. This is not right. Okay, we'll probably get into it later. There's my friend here, Shalom from Kenya Noahide Messianic Corner. God bless you. Thank you for popping along. and I had a lot of questions about Stalin from that channel. We have Shalom Alechem from Fermenting, and Shalom Alechem from Cool Dog. Thank you very much. And the Freilichen Hanukkah to you as well. God bless you, Cool Dog. Thank you so much. That is because we're on Hanukkah right now. So happy Hanukkah, and of course Nittel Gadol for everybody else who is celebrating Nittel. And I should probably get back to this more next week if I have a chance to, and I will if I do have a chance, but I do have to go. I've run out of time. So God bless you all. Take care, and Shabbat Shalom. Bye-bye.